When I arrived, the King of Blefuscu sent 2 guides to show me the way to the capital. There I met the King, the Queen, and the lords and ladies in their coaches. I explained that I had come to visit Blefuscu, as I had been invited. However, I did not say anything about the punishment waiting for me in Lilliput. They welcomed me warmly. That night, as there was no building big enough for me, I slept on the ground, covered by my blanket. It was not as comfortable as my bed in Lilliput, but I did not mind. I did not spend long in Blefuscu. Only 3 days after my arrival, I noticed a boat in the sea, near the beach. It was a real boat, large enough for me. Perhaps it had been driven there by a storm. I swam out to it and tied ropes to it. Then, with the help of 20 of Blefuscu's ships and 3,000 sailors, I pulled it onto the beach. It was not badly damaged, and it was exciting to be able to start planning my journey back to England and my home. During this time, the King of Lilliput had written to ask the King of Blefuscu to send me back as a prisoner so that I could receive my punishment. The King of Blefuscu, however, replied that I was too strong to be taken prisoner, and that I would soon be returning to my country anyway. Secretly, he invited me to stay and help him in Blefuscu, but I no longer believed in the promises of kings or their officials, so I politely refused. I was now impatient to start my voyage home, and the king ordered his workmen to repair the boat and prepare everything I needed. I had the meat of 100 cattle and 300 sheep to eat on the journey, and I also had some live animals to show to my friends in England. About 1 month later, I left Blefuscu on September the 24th, 1701. The king, the queen, and their lords and ladies all came down to the beach to wave goodbye. After sailing all day, I reached a small island where I slept that night. On the 3rd day, September the 26th, I saw a sail and was delighted to discover that it was an English ship on its way home to England. The captain picked me up, and I told him my story. At first, he thought I was mad, but when I took the live animals out of my pocket to show him, he believed me. We arrived home at last on April the 13th, 1702, and I saw my dear wife and children again. At first, I was delighted to be at home again. I earned quite a lot of money by showing my Lilliputian animals to people, and in the end, I sold them for a high price. But as the days passed, I became restless and wanted to see more of the world. And so, only 2 months later, I said goodbye to my family and sailed away again. Chapter 5. A Voyage to Brobdingnag. I left Bristol on June the 20th, 1702, in a ship which was sailing to India. We had good sailing weather until we reached the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, where we landed to get fresh water. We had to stay there for the winter, however, because the ship needed repairs, and the captain was ill. In the spring, we left Africa and sailed round the island of Madagascar into the Indian Ocean. But on the 19th of April, the wind began to blow very violently from the west, and we were driven to the east of the Malacca Islands. On the 2nd of May, the wind stopped blowing, and the sea was calm. But our captain, who knew that part of the world very well, warned us that there would be a storm the next day. So we prepared the ship as well as we could and waited. The captain was right. On the 3rd of May, the wind began to get stronger. It was a wild, dangerous wind, blowing from the south this time. We had to take down our sails as the storm hit our ship. Huge waves crashed down onto us, and the wind drove our helpless ship eastwards into the Pacific Ocean. For several days we struggled with the wind and waves, but at last the storm died away and the sea was calm again. Luckily, our ship was not badly damaged, but we had been driven over 2,000 kilometers to the east. None of us knew exactly where we were, so the captain decided to continue sailing eastwards, where we had never been before. We sailed on for another 2 weeks. Finally, on the 16th of June, 1703, we saw a large island with a small piece of land joined to it. I later discovered that this country was called Brobdingnag. The captain sent some of his sailors in a boat to land there and bring back some fresh water. I went with them because I was interested in seeing a new country. We were delighted to be on land again, and while the men looked for a river or a lake, I walked for about 1 kilometer away from the beach. When I returned, to my astonishment, I saw that the sailors were already in the boat. They were rowing as fast as they could towards the ship. I was going to shout to tell them they had forgotten me, when suddenly I saw a huge creature walking after them into the sea. I realized he could not catch them because they had nearly got to the ship, but I did not wait to see the end of that adventure. I ran away from him as fast as possible and did not stop until I found myself in some fields. The grass was about 7 meters high, and the corn about 13 meters high. It took me an hour to cross just one field, which had a hedge at least 40 meters high. The trees were much taller than that. Just as I was trying to find a hole in the hedge, so that I could get into the next field, I saw another giant coming towards me. He seemed as tall as a mountain, and every one of his steps measured about 10 meters. In fear and astonishment, I hid in the corn and hoped he would not notice me. He shouted in a voice like thunder, and 7 other giants appeared. They seemed to be his servants. When he gave the order, they began to cut the corn in the field where I was hiding. As they moved towards me, I moved away, but at last I came to a part of the field where rain had knocked down the corn. There was no longer anywhere for me to hide, and I knew I would be cut to pieces by the giant's sharp knives. I lay down and prepared to die. I could not stop myself thinking of Lilliput. There, I myself had been a giant, an important person, who had become famous for helping the people of that small country. Here, it was the opposite. I was like a Lilliputian in Europe, and I began to understand how a very small creature feels. Suddenly, I noticed that one of the giants was very close to me. As his huge foot rose over my head, I screamed as loudly as I could. He looked around on the ground and finally saw me. He stared at me for a moment, then very carefully he picked me up with finger and thumb and looked at me. I was now 20 meters up in the air, and I desperately hoped he would not decide to throw me to the ground. I did not struggle and spoke politely to him, although I knew he did not understand any of my languages. He took me to the farmer, who soon realized that I was not an animal, but an intelligent being. He carefully put me in his pocket and took me home to show to his wife. When she saw me, she screamed and jumped back in fear, perhaps thinking I was an insect. But in a little while, she became used to me and was very kind to me. Chapter 6. Gulliver and his Master. Soon after we arrived, the whole family sat down at the table for dinner. There was a large piece of meat on a plate about 8 meters across. The farmer put me on the table with some small pieces of bread and meat in front of me. I was very frightened of falling off the edge of the table, which was 10 meters from the ground. The farmer and his family were delighted to watch me eating food with my own small knife and fork. But when I started walking across the table to the farmer, his youngest son, a boy of about 10, picked me up by the legs. He held me so high in the air that my whole body trembled. Fortunately, his father took me away at once and angrily hit the boy hard on the head. But I remembered how cruel children can be to small animals, and I did not want the boy to take his revenge on me. So I fell on my knees and asked them not to punish the child any more. They seemed to understand. Just then, I heard a noise behind me. It sounded like 12 machines running at the same time. I turned my head and saw a huge cat, 3 times larger than one of our cows. The farmer's wife held it in her arms so that it could not jump at me. But in fact, because I showed no fear, there was no danger, and the cat even seemed a little afraid of me. At the end of dinner, a servant came in with the farmer's 1-year-old son in her arms. He immediately started crying and screaming because he wanted to play with me. His mother smiled and put me in his hand. When he picked me up and put my head in his mouth, I shouted so loudly that he dropped me. Luckily, I was not hurt, but it showed me how dangerous life was going to be in Brobdingnag. After eating, the farmer, or my master, as I shall now call him, went back to his work in the fields. I think he told his wife to take good care of me, because she put me carefully on her bed and locked the bedroom door. I was exhausted and slept for 2 hours. When I woke up, I felt very small and lonely in such a huge room, and on such a large bed. Suddenly, I saw two huge rats run towards me across the bed. One came right up to my face, so I pulled out my sword and cut open his stomach. The other ran away at once. I walked up and down on the bed to control my trembling legs and looked at the dead rat. It was as large as a big dog, and its tail measured 2 meters. When my master's wife came into the room some time later, I showed her how I had killed the rat. She was delighted that I was not hurt, and threw the dead rat out of the window. My master had a daughter who was about 9 years old. She was given the special responsibility of taking care of me, and I owe her my life. During my stay in her country, we were always together, and she saved me from many dangerous situations. I called her Glumdalclitch, which means little nurse. She was good at sewing, and managed to make some clothes for me in the thinnest material available. She also made me a small bed, which was placed on a shelf too high for rats to reach. Perhaps the most useful thing she did was to teach me the language, so that in a few days I could speak it quite well. Soon, all my master's neighbors were talking about the strange little creature he had found in a field. One of them came to see me, and as I walked towards him across the table, he put on his glasses. His eyes behind the glasses looked like the full moon shining into 2 windows. I thought this was very funny and laughed loudly. Unfortunately, that made him very angry. I heard him whispering to my master all evening, and I was sorry I had laughed at him. Next day, Glumdalclitch came to me in tears. "You'll never guess what's happened," she told me sadly. "Our neighbor has advised Father to show you to people for money. Father's going to take you to market tomorrow, where there'll be crowds of people ready to pay for entertainment. Oh, I'm so ashamed. And perhaps you'll get hurt. Other people won't be as careful with you as I am." "Don't worry, Glumdalclitch," I replied. "As I'm a stranger here, I don't mind being shown to people like a strange wild animal. I must do what your father wants." I was secretly hoping I would one day find a way of escaping and returning to my own country. So the next day, my master and his daughter got on their huge horse. Glumdalclitch carried me inside a small box, which had air holes so that I could breathe. When we arrived at the market town, my master hired the largest room in the public house and placed me upon the table there. His daughter stayed close to me to make sure that nobody hurt me. I was told to speak in their language, pull out my sword, drink from a cup, and do other things to amuse the crowd. Only 30 people were allowed in to see me at one time. On that first day, everybody wanted to see me, and I was shown to over 350 people.